Welcome to Panel 4, IP and the Startup Economy, a subject matter near and dear to my heart. As Mark knows, I came to academia from being a general counsel at a startup company, so this is a good subject for me. I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Ashlyn Roberts, Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Venture Capital Association. We have Zvi Rosen, Associate Professor of Law, University of New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce School of Law. We have Mark Schultz, as I'm sure we all know, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron. He's also the Director, the Intellectual Property Technology Law Program, and Faculty Chair and Senior Scholar of the IPPI. And last but not least, we have Robert Taylor, owner and founder of RPT Legal Strategies PC. Just to start things off, I'm just going to start off with a general question for our panelists and give them a chance to introduce themselves further and to speak on this topic. Well, as we know, the overall title of today's thing is IP and National Success. So when we talk about IP and national success, what is the concrete role of innovation and intellectual property policy in enabling startups not just to exist, but to scale, attract capital, compete against established incumbents, both domestically and globally?
What I wanted to do is to pick up where the first panel, or where one of the, actually a couple of the panels this morning left off. Jamie Simpson, for example, mentioned that we have a working model of what government policies can actually produce disruptive innovation. And we should look back at that disruptive model and see how it came about and what changed it. So I'm going to expand on the discussion this morning and talk about some of that. There's been a lot of discussion of the Bayh-Dole Act, and so I don't need to really cover that. But I do intend to focus on some of the other federal policies that came together at or about the same time as the Bayh-Dole Act was put into law. And they created a literal explosion of new companies, highly innovative new technologies. If you just think about it, it's not just in the pharmaceutical industry, which is what Bayh-Dole had the greatest impact on, but it was in the telecommunications business. The internet really was built out, and the internet was not just a public project. There were thousands of innovative inventions that had to be put together to make the internet work the way it works today. There was innovation in virtually every technology you can think of in that time period following 1980. So I consider that to be a watershed moment in thinking about American disruptive innovation. And it was driven in large part by startups and their venture capital investors. They created a technology-based economy that became the envy of other countries around the world. And some of our largest companies today in Silicon Valley were startups in that time frame. This discussion to me is really important because it illustrates what it is we need to do or we would like to do. Whether we're ever going to get there is, I think, questionable. But my hope is that we will soon implement policies similar to those that were put in place in 1980 in hopes of rekindling disruptive innovation. And I will tell you that what happened in 1980 was about a 180-degree reversal of federal policies prior to that time. When I use the term disruptive innovation, I'm talking about the kind of innovation that means in which younger and more flexible startups and small companies challenge and ultimately replace older established technologies. And that's really important today because a lot of the large digital companies digital technology companies in our economy have gone out of their way to try to persuade Congress and others that these are really the innovative companies. And if you look at a company like Cisco, innovation doesn't occur at Cisco. Innovation occurs it doesn't occur in the R&D department or the engineering department. It occurs in the M&A department. Cisco has acquired something like 300 smaller companies over the course of its 25 or 30-year existence. And each of the other companies, whenever you see one of these large tech companies doing something that's really innovative, and perhaps in some ways, in terms of physical design, Apple's the exception to this, but the core electronics in a smartphone are not electronics by and large that were developed at Apple. They were acquired by Apple. It's well documented that disruptive innovations, innovations that push aside other technologies and replace them, come from smaller companies. There's just a vast amount of economic literature on that. The ones that I cite regularly are Christian Clayton's Innovator's Dilemma, which is now 15 or 20 years old, and he gives case examples of companies that were well established in one technology and that tried to innovate in a way that would make that technology irrelevant, and they couldn't do it. They failed, or they lost to their profitability and had to reorganize. There's a book that I sometimes talk about, and that's Chris Miller's Chip Wars. And he mentions in Chip Wars that Intel was given the opportunity to become the microprocessor for the smartphone. And Intel took a look at their existing profit stream, and they said, if we do that, we will cut into our own markets. And so they passed up the mobile revolution. And it is typical of what happens. It took companies like ARM, which was a very small company, to become the microprocessor for the smartphone. So those are examples. The recently issued notice of proposed rulemaking from the Patent Office last October cites a couple of other studies that talk about the absolute critical aspect of startups to the innovation economy, and that if you haven't taken a look at that, it's worth looking at. And those studies that they cite are pretty powerful. Most everybody in this room probably knows Mark Limley, and Mark wrote a piece that was published last fall in Antitrust Magazine called Co-opting Disruption. And he talks about something that's important here. He says, while there are many reasons for the tech giants' continued dominance, and he's talking specifically about Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta, but you can add some other ones in there as well. Many reasons for the tech giants' continued dominance. We think an important and overlooked one is that they have learned how to co-opt disruption. They identify potentially disruptive technologies, use their money to influence the startups developing them, strategically dole out access to resources the startups need to grow, and seek regulation that will make it harder for startups to compete. When a threat emerges, they buy it off. After they acquire a startup, they redirect its people and assets to their own innovation needs. The thing that makes this so powerful is that it comes from Mark, who has been a very strong supporter of Google for as long as I've known him. But let me get back to another aspect of what we're talking about, and what happened in and around 1980 that is what I sometimes refer to as the Cambrian explosion of technology growth. During the 30 years leading up to 1980, the U.S. economy benefited largely from the enormous investments and breakthroughs that were created during the Second World War and that were largely responsible for winning the war. But these were products, these were technologies needed for the war effort, and very few of those were really directed to consumer products, and that includes also the space race, which was basically supervised by the military, and satellite TV or satellite the launching of satellites and the astronaut crew to the moon were really a military project. During the same time period between 1950 and 1980, consumer industries became increasingly moribund. This is what the economist, you heard the quote this morning, that Doane rescued the American industry or American economy from industrial irrelevance. Excuse me. The auto industry gives us a perfect example. 3 companies in 1970 dominated U.S. auto production. They didn't innovate. They didn't have to because they were the only 3 companies. General Motors had 50% of the market. Ford and Chrysler shared another 45%. And there were no foreign cars coming in, and there were very few. And then the oil shortage occurred in the early 70s. Americans demanded more fuel-efficient vehicles, and the European and Japanese auto companies were the ones who were able to supply that demand. And today, the foreign suppliers of automobiles have more than 50% of the American market. And it's just it's a case study, and this happened in other industries as well. I've written and talked a lot about the color television industry. Color television was invented in this country, and RCA, GE, and Motorola were the 3 companies that created most of the technology that went into color television. But by 1980, the Japanese Trinitron was the best-selling color TV in the world, and the American television industry was on its way to becoming to completely closing. Same thing was true with digital video recorders, invented at Ampex. The Panasonic took the market over, and Ampex ultimately went out of that business. A number of synergistic changes occurred in or around 1980 that reversed that decline in American industry. One is that ERISA, the statute that governs how pension funds invest their money, ERISA was modified in 1979 to allow pension funds to invest a small portion of their portfolios in high-risk venture capital, firms that carried higher risk but promised greater returns. And that made large sums available to the venture capital industry right about the same time that there was a real interest in improving innovation. In 1980, we've talked about the Bayh-Dole Act, which freed up access to lots of government scientific research. In 1982, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit was created, which, if you ever paid attention to the Federal Circuit's early days, Howard Markey, who was the chief judge of that court, believed that he had been anointed to revitalize the American patent system, and that was his mission for about the first 20 years of that court. And he did it in so many ways. It was just, it was remarkable, and it was a tremendous benefit to companies, inventors, small companies that relied on their patents to justify investing in new technologies. The Supreme Court in 1980 also decided a case called Dawson versus Roman Haas. And this was the first time that a patent owner won a case in the Supreme Court, a patent antitrust case, in 40 years. The previous 40 years, every single case that the Supreme Court decided held that the patents were either unenforceable or were subject to a treble damage counterclaim under the antitrust laws. And Dawson is notable because the court there, the Supreme Court there, commented on how important patents really are to investment and raising capital, and it's an important inflection point in the antitrust laws. Also, in the same vein, newly elected President Reagan appointed Bill Baxter, who was a free market economist lawyer, to head the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. And one of the first things General Baxter did was to end policies at the DOJ that discouraged the licensing of patents. This, too, was a very important change because lawyers were extremely careful about not allowing their clients to enter into licenses that ran any kind of antitrust risk because the penalties for violation of the antitrust laws were so severe. And the net effect of that, I was practicing during a good part of this time, the net effect of that was to discourage the type of licensing that would make commercial sense to a patent owner. And so technologies just sat used if possible by the company that developed them and not available to anyone else. And licensing is really important in this discussion because a simple answer to the licensing issues is that licensing depends on reliable and enforceable patents, without which patent owners face much higher risks in trying to license their technology. Licensing allows an inventor who may not have the expertise or resources to manufacture a product at scale to find collaborators to help with that. But for that process to work, both a reasonable expectation that your license is legal and enforceable patents are kind of the sine qua non of being able to do that. So from an economic point of view, with respect to licensing, I recommend a superb paper by Steve Haber at Stanford and Naomi Lamoureux at Yale, which became the introduction of their anthology called Patent Battles. They examine a production chain from invention to manufacturing to distribution to sales, pointing out that the only money that comes into that production stack is from when the end user actually buys a product. And the way that the patent licensing works is to help distribute the profitability from the sale all the way back to the person who invented the new technology. It's a very useful model to think about.
Okay, I'm going to talk about some research I did on the relationship between venture capital investment and the reliability of patent rights, using a data set that Bob was actually really important to getting for me. We were able to look at venture capital investments across different sectors of the economy from 2006 through 2017. Now, that was a period of tremendous change in the patent system. And the question was whether it affected venture capital investment. Okay, so let's have a look at that. What we found was that IP policy plays a large part in determining where investment capital, particularly VC capital, flows. And where venture capital flows determines which startups get funded, the type of businesses that get built, and the kind of innovation that gets pursued. And so between 2006 and 2017, the U.S. patent system, I know this audience knows this, the U.S. patent system changed in ways that made patents harder to obtain, easier to invalidate, and more difficult to enforce. Injunctions became more uncertain after eBay. Patent eligibility narrowed after Mayo, Myriad, and Alice. The American Invents Act introduced inter partes review, increasing invalidation risk. And enforcement just generally became more expensive and less predictable. And whatever the merits of each policy change individually, the cumulative effect was that patent reliability declined. And for industries that depend on enforceable exclusivity, particularly life sciences, that changes the basic calculation of risk and return. Now, investors price risk. The more risky the industry, the less capital investors can commit to it. And it's not just because they are spiteful, it's because they have fiduciary duties. Bob talked about ERISA. A lot of venture capitalists are investing people's pension money. They have to invest it where there's a safer return, a relatively safer return. You make return less safe, people invest less. And that's a problem for startups because startups don't have revenue, they have ideas, and IP is what turns those ideas into an investable asset. And particularly in biotech and pharmaceuticals, medical devices, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing, patents aren't just decorations or signals. They're a bridge between the science and a usable medicine or product. And if that bridge weakens, the capital reroutes. And economic research is pretty clear on this point. When expected returns decline, R&D declines. In the language of economics, innovation elasticity is positive. And so when we reduce expected revenue, whether through weaker exclusivity or pricing controls, investors scale back long horizon bets. And we've seen some surveys, particularly from David Taylor at SMU, that confirm this sensitivity. Life sciences investors, for example, report that patents material affect their willingness to invest. He found that venture capital investors who were familiar with patent eligibility narrowing, and most were, reported by and large that they were investing less in industries that were affected. And so I've got some data on what happened when the patent system became less reliable. Now, venture capital overall didn't shrink from the early 2000s to today. It grew a lot, but it reallocated away from patent-intensive industries as risk and uncertainty grew. And that's what you see the downward line here from basically right before eBay through the time period after the eligibility decisions. We see a decline in venture capital and patent-intensive industries. So in this period after eBay and the launch of the PTAB and court decisions that narrowed patent eligibility, capital moved towards sectors that depend less on IP and away from patent-intensive industries. Here we see the blue line is starting in 2004. What we see in the blue bar there on the screen is that the majority of venture capital, a slight majority, was allocated toward patent-intensive industries. That declined precipitously over those years, while non-patent-intensive industries claimed a much greater share. And we see this here. One of the industries that particularly thrived was software. So we see that top line is patent-intensive manufacturing declining from over 50% of venture capital investment to below 30% by the end of the period, whereas software benefits during this time. Software skyrockets from mid-20s to over 40%. We see some particular specific sectors. When we look at some of the sectors that particularly lost, we see pharmaceuticals collapsing from 7% of total VC funding to under 1% for pharmaceutical startups. Medical device investment losing about half their share. Semiconductor startups declined in both terms of their share of venture capital, but absolute dollars as well. And computer hardware investment similarly cratered. And this wasn't random. These were the industries with the longest development timelines. They have heavy regulatory burdens, and they have a strong dependence on enforceable patents. So what industries did thrive? Well, software thrived. Healthcare technology systems thrived. Particularly in the software sector, social media thrived. And we saw some other money going into things that hadn't really enjoyed venture capital before. Apparel and accessories, food and beverage, restaurants, hotel and leisure. Now, these are, of course, industries that have some value. We like nice hotels and restaurants. We're in a nice hotel, but they aren't like socially valuable as an Alzheimer's treatment. And when we look at this from a national competitiveness standpoint, the question's really simple. If risk returns look better in software than semiconductors, if consumer apps look safer than biologics, capital will optimize. It has to. They have fiduciary duties. And over time, industrial capacity follows capital allocation. The technologies most dependent on long horizon IP, like biologics, advanced manufacturing, diagnostics, semiconductor hardware, are the same technologies tied to health security and supply chain resilience, energy transition, defense capability. In the end, patent policy is industrial policy, whether we admit it or not. And startups do not need guaranteed profits, but they need predictable rules. And when patents become less reliable, capital becomes more cautious in exactly the sectors that require the most patience. And so we see this shift away from what are arguably more socially valuable, many times more socially valuable industries, industries that help make us competitive, toward things like food and beverage, leisure, social media. We call those things, some of those things tech, some of those things aren't tech at all, but they're not the kind of tech on which national competitiveness is typically built in all cases. Now, there certainly are some of those that are valuable for national competitiveness, but we're not keeping up with the great policies that Bob talked about that were historically present. Okay, so I will put the other PowerPoint back up, and why don't you turn it over, Mike, to their next speaker.
Speak.
Hey, folks. Hope everyone's having a good afternoon. So some of you know me and are saying, why is Zvi there? He's a copyright guy. And I didn't quite know myself, honestly. But as I've had a chance to explore Disney World just a bit, and then with a wonderful keynote speaker we had at lunch, is there any better example that copyright is innovation than Disney World? I mean, the incredible Imagineering, the incredible combination of technical know-how and whimsy and creativity and this fusion, which is innovative. Now, I don't want to be rude to our hosts. Disney's not a startup. But at one point they were, right? At one point, it was Walt Disney and Ojai Works and drawing cartoons. But of course, they weren't drawing Mickey Mouse at first. They were drawing Oswald, the friendly rabbit. And Disney famously lost the rights to Oswald to Universal because of a series of bad contracts. Now, I'm not aware if Disney soon get Oswald back, although, as some of you know, they actually did get Oswald back through a trade with NBC Universal for Al Michaels. But It's a true story. But if you're a small business today and you want to sue for copyright infringement today, it's not going to be cheap. In 2023, a copyright case, including discovery with appeals, cost an average of $811,000. Incidentally, I know I'm in a room of patent people, and you all are laughing and saying that's nothing. I get it, but if you are in an attic drawing cartoons of a rabbit, that's still a lot of money. And so we have these startups, these small businesses that are creating copyrighted material. How can the law allow them to really protect what they're creating? Copyrighted material is incredibly easy to copy and share these days on the internet. And it can be very difficult to protect. I mean, listen, if someone takes your content, uploads it to YouTube, it can be surprisingly difficult to get taken down. I mean, let's say you send a DMCA takedown. Well, if the other side says that it's a fair use, you have to actually take them into court just to get it to stay down right now. If we're not in the USA, I mean, good luck. I mean, they'll say fair use, and you really don't have much for recourse. So over the past couple of years, we've had this new entity created, the Copyright Claims Board. Those of us who were around before started, we'll call it the Case Act Court, but it's a CCB now. And this was formulated as effectively a small claims court within the Library of Congress that aims to provide a sort of mediation/adjudication service. It's not only for small businesses. In fact, larger businesses have used it, but the aim is to be accessible to non-lawyers. There's also a provision of it which quite specifically allows law school clinics to practice. And I'm pleased to say that the UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law will be doing more of that coming up. So damages are capped for the whole action to $30,000. There's also a micro option of $5,000. And the goal is to give small businesses that are really just starting up the ability to enforce their rights. A couple of weeks ago, they came out with a report on how they've been doing, and I thought I'd share some of their findings. There have been about 1,700 claims filed with the CCB. 2/3 of those have been pro se. So it's really been reaching this promise of making justice accessible to small creators and startups in the copyright sector. Now, the Case Act specifically allows for people to opt out. And I remember when this act was being considered, we were told one of two things. Either A, it's going to be a vehicle for, please put quotes in the record, copyright trolls, or everyone's going to opt out. And the same people who were really concerned about one were also warning us to be worthless because of the other. Turns out there have been 181 opt-outs, so that's about 1/10 of the actions filed. Now, unfortunately, there haven't been a ton of determinations either. So far, there have been 43 cases that have reached a conclusion since the court began operations in 2022. However, there's also been 160 settlements that arose out of the action. So it's a bigger percentage than that. Where there was a determination, the average amount awarded was $3,500 or so. Not a lot of money, certainly not the sort of money where people hire anyone in this room, but real money for a small business. Now, the final statistic, one that I think gives me a lot of pause, 35% of claims were dismissed for failure to serve. I think that's a problem. And when the law was being drafted, there was understandably concerns about due process. Service and due process are important. But equally, expecting people who are drawing pictures of a rabbit and posting them to YouTube, which have been copied, for instance, have them hire a process server to handle this, it's quite a bit of work for what should be a fairly simple sort of action. One of the things I really think is they need to fix service. There needs to be a way for people to serve potentially by email, if that can be worked out. I've suggested that where there was a DMCA takedown already filed and they responded, that you should be able to respond to that email and they'll count as service if it's for the same work. There's been the goal to allow increased mediation. And finally, and the other thing to work out, if there's a damages award, you still have to go to federal court to enforce it, which is a bit of a problem. Perhaps why there's this additional incentive for people to try to say, no, I'm not going to opt out. I'm going to, sit through this whole action, let you get your $3,500, and then I will say, all right, and now sue me to collect. So there's some real obstacles to this becoming a tool that startups and small businesses can use, but I think that it shows a lot of promise. I'm looking forward to what the future holds.
All right. And so everyone, it's nice to meet you. Ashlyn Roberts from the National Venture Capital Association. Thought I'd start just with a really quick introduction in case folks aren't familiar with our association. We are the trade association for all U.S.-based venture capital. So there's only one of us, and we actually have members that span pretty much every investment vertical possible. So for the purposes of this conversation, I think we're definitely going to be focusing more on hardware and of course, industries spanning like deep tech, robotics, semiconductors, advanced materials, defense, biotech, life sciences as the last panel as well. But we do have members kind of across the spectrum and investing in every stage of the life cycle. Think as early as pre-seed to as late as growth, but strictly venture capital, not private equity. And we have a location in every state, I think, except for 5. We have VC presence. I think we're still trying to, bolster VC presence in Alaska. I think hopefully that's on the rise. But then also we are fortunate to have portfolio companies across every state. So that's a very quick kind of primer on who we are. I will say in terms of, I appreciate your great presentation on kind of the history of venture capital. I will caveat that, correlation is huge. I will also say that in 2000, right around the 2006 eBay was also, some other situational situations like the financial crisis, the rise of SaaS, but I will say to your point, the value of, seeing the difference between software and hardware and capital intensity, which I think is critically important in kind of evaluating the ROI as VCs do funnel their investments into various industries. So very briefly, just wanted to kind of start with a macro view on how we look at various issue sets. So just kind of go through a couple of the top ones, starting a little bit broader than IP, but also with IP. Starting with kind of business model policy, we'd really focus on, anything from, the tax amortization credits. I think that was mentioned earlier from the One Big Beautiful Bill. We absolutely advocate for that, as well as promoting QSBS, qualified small business stock, and the One Big Beautiful Bill to continue to incentivize investment in the industry at large. I'm lucky enough to, represent the most optimistic folks that are investing in the future of the United States. And so making sure to continue to incentivize that capital is absolutely critical to us. I would say next would be the capital markets policy landscape, which really is continuing to ease fundraising and investment decision environments for what we call exempt reporting advisors, ERAs, and registered investment advisors, RIAs, those that are registered with the SEC. So we do take the stance that no one should unnecessarily have to register. And so currently you do need to register if a VC surpasses a 20% qualifying threshold of investments in fund of funds and secondaries. And as folks in the investment market know, that secondaries is a lot of the landscape right now. So making sure that folks can continue the investment while also continuing our work to smooth the IPO on-ramp. Then I'd kind of go into the next bucket, which is encouraging a pipeline that works, which is, I think, really where a lot of the conversation and a lot of the great reports and statistics with venture dollars we're really pointing towards today. Public R&D funding is absolutely critical to venture capital. I think every panel has woven that into the sentiment today. And, what is fantastic is initial discovery is maybe we'll start with healthcare we're James out of NIH, and then we'll go towards a tech transfer office for a spin out, then picked up by venture capital dollars, which then we'll be able to catalyze that and grow it into commercialization. And then once, either the VC recoups their investment from either a company going public, which is obviously increasingly difficult these days, or acquisition or failure, then that is when they're able to recoup that investment and fund that money back into that pipeline and go on to invest that next tranche of dollars. As many of you all know, VCs are serial entrepreneurs and then serial VCs, and so they really are continuing to try to innovate on the next kind of most just technologically advanced opportunities out there. I would say, as I mentioned, tech transfer. Definitely, we applaud all of the work of Bidole. I was just on a panel with Joe Allen from the Bidole Coalition a couple weeks ago, I believe, in the House of Representatives, talking about the importance of Bidole and really just celebrating kind of this entire pipeline and a collaborative ecosystem to keep U.S. competitive, especially in industries where China is competing with us right now. And then also, I know that conversation, which is probably a little bit tangential, but pulling on that thread, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, was the importance of, research dollars and calling out the SBIR, STTR programs. I don't think I've heard that today. That is something that is very relevant and timely, and it is a program that stalled in September at the end of the last fiscal year. And so unfortunately it is stalled, but we have been strongly advocating for the reauthorization of that program, as well as, helping to expand the program and having some improvements to it as well. And so we're hoping and optimistic that we'll be seeing legislation on that sometime soon. And then I'd say regulatory on-ramps, I think that as some of the other panelists talked about, time to approval is, important as approval itself. So, I'm sure we can pull that thread a little bit more later, but I think everyone's articulated really well that venture capital likes certainty, entrepreneurs like certainty. The more uncertainty in a environment that is, a higher probability that folks will not recoup their investment. And so that is a part of the game that is venture capital. Folks, swing for the fences, understanding that many of their investments will fail, but hoping that that one will kind of recoup the investment to be able to pay for the others. And so this is kind of how the industry works. And so definitely making sure that to ensure that, that this entire pipeline and flywheel can keep going is absolutely critical. And I know that's, a lot of the regulatory uncertainty that we've been seeing, and I know an earlier panel said with the pendulum continuing to swing, is obviously problematic for folks that are investing on, a 10 plus year time horizon. And then lastly, I touched on the smoothing the IPO market, but also just encouraging, as I mentioned earlier, this a strong M&A market as well, because for those that do not fail, the goal is acquisition to be able to return money to the investors. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for all those great opening remarks. If we define national success as sustained innovation, leadership, job creation, and technological resilience, what does a startup need from policymakers to deliver that outcome?
Well, one of the things they need is reliable property rights. They need reliable, predictable property rights. And we haven't done such a good job on reliability and predictability. When the American Vents Act was passed, there was supposed to be, I guess there was sort of this implicit understanding that we were done. We were never done. There's been one proposal after another every year. There has been some tinkering, but there's never been a let up in the attempts to change property rights. But I'll also say, if intellectual property is one of the things, there's two other I's that startups need from our government. Investment. We've talked about that. Investment in basic science that can be translated and commercialized for startups. We need investment, of course, from venture capital investors. We need to make sure that is something still attractive. And the third I is immigration. So many of our startups are started by people who are, brilliant minds who historically, for decades, have come from all over the world for the opportunities we provide. And we're not doing too well on all three of these legs right now, I'd say. So we need to improve greatly if we want to be competitive.
I'll definitely echo the on that last I. I think that is, the United States is what it is because of the talent that it has attracted and continues to attract. And so, as you all know, the average entrepreneur, they're very oftentimes an immigrant to this country, and we actually advocate for something called the startup visa, which would give them a pathway to citizenship, because what we want to do is we want to keep the great inventions once we, have the brain trust that we have created thus far.
When Mark talked about strengthening property rights, it would help to make it clear that patents, in fact, are property. In the oil states, the U.S. Supreme Court, in their greater wisdom, with help from a SG brief from the Biden administration, ruled essentially that patents are a government franchise that can be revoked. That's not a property right. And for these things to have the kind of integrity and long-lasting durability, they have to be treated as property.
I'll just say very briefly, I think institutional stability is necessary. I mean, in copyright, we're seeing some pretty substantial chaos right now because of an unwillingness to provide for institutional stability at the Copyright Office, by coming out of the administration. And it's a problem, I think, regardless of political orientation.
Just following up on something Mark said about reliability, patent reliability, to what extent do changes in patent reliability or enforcement affect capital allocation decisions? And how does that affect startups?
So when somebody chooses to make an investment, all their calculations are forward-looking. They look at the size of the opportunity, but then they have to discount it by time and the risk, and then anything we do to change those things makes investments either more expensive. In other words, the VC has to ask for more because a $3 billion opportunity, it looks actually very small in its value today because you don't know whether it's going to happen. And every time you reduce the return, increase the risk, you make either the investments more expensive or, more importantly, less viable. And we've seen this, we've had, in terms of economics research, there's been an opportunity with the IRA to see this happening and the early returns now as people are researching, looking at measuring what's been happening when the IRA now reduces the promise of return, through price controls. We're seeing reduced investment. And it's just math. In the end, it's math. And it's also, as I said, it's not just math when investors make these decisions. It's fiduciary responsibility. They have to put their money in a safer place, a less risky place. There's investments they won't make. They'll make other investments in preference. A lot of investments in AI, but it also could be new social media, could be new restaurants, it could be new hotels, but it's less likely to be some of these more risky startups.
And I totally agree with that. I will say that every investment, I think, is valuable for the U.S. economy, for jobs, for GDP. But in terms of if you're pulling on the life sciences thread, I mean, that is the riskiest and the longest time horizon of most of the investment verticals. And so definitely when you kind of that return on investment becomes questioned, that obviously could influence dollars flowing elsewhere to balance out their portfolio, because typically VCs, there's definitely a significant number of healthcare VCs that, well, specifically biotech and life sciences VCs, that are still practicing physicians. So they do it because they care and they want to give back. But they do still have to balance a portfolio. And to Mark's point, make sure to have they have the fiduciary duty to return money to their limited partners. And so that they do have to return money to their endowments, their pensions. And so making sure that they're able to do so absolutely is critical. And so ensuring that policy continues to encourage investment is quite critical. And then one thing I wanted to call out is that folks hear venture capital and they think of the biggest names ever, but the actual medium-sized venture fund is only $21 million. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's really not when you're thinking about all of the money that's being poured in. And so, I would also add, as much as we could continue to streamline regulatory compliance as well, that the startup economy isn't only the startups that folks are investing in, but it's also, a lot of VCs are startups in and of themselves. And so they're a couple, men shop that are funneling money into the next greatest innovation.
Already speak? Yeah. Okay. How could this administration best support startups?
I'm sure we could all answer that. I would say that we're definitely optimistic with some of the new USPTO leadership and then PRM that came out. I will say, kind of beyond that, definitely kind of regulatory streamlining is something that we're spending a lot of our time with, at various agencies. Kind of going even just beyond USPTO, we are working with the SEC, the FDA, HHS at large, DOW, to really continue to incentivize private capital and into the signal that the government is wanting to further R&D. And
so Ashlyn mentioned SBIR, STTR, and those are really great programs that bring together small businesses, in many cases with the military. And if we're going to be prioritizing fixing a trade deficit, I think improving exporting would be a great thing to do. I think investment in the SBA resources for startups would be a great idea. I think there is a large network of those already, and I think focusing on perhaps more high-tech startups would be a great idea for some of the SBA resource centers, and just generally focus on, these are huge export sectors. Make sure they're able to export.
I think we really have to get Congress aboard to do something about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, and David Kapos this morning mentioned the Patent Eligibility Restoration Act, eligibility has become just a complete gobbledygook of judicial judicial writing that no one really understands. And the courts, the Federal Circuit, not too long ago, I think all 12 judges of the Federal Circuit said, please, Supreme Court, take this and clarify the law because we don't understand it. And it's pretty clear from the rulings that they've made that they don't. The injunction, you don't have a patent without an injunction. It just doesn't. It's not a real patent. It's not an exclusive right. And the Supreme Court in the eBay case kind of slipped past that one by saying, well, there's a difference between a right and a remedy. That's just judicial craftsmanship that I think is really outrageous. And the court in the KSR case has made obviousness a doctrine without guardrails, and leaving individual judges and individual courts the freedom to decide that something is obvious, even where the challenger to the patent comes forward with 6 or 7 different references to demonstrate the obviousness of this submitted invention. So we really need, if we want to have a viable patent system that's useful to startups, we really need some help from Congress.
Yeah. Well, we're at about an hour now. Just are there any questions from out there? Yes, Bob.
Bob, on your comment about we need help from Congress, and I fully agree. And the question is, what can the various groups here do to work together to put together an education program for the congressional staffs and for the members? Because we need to be able to have something that these guys are clueless. And the more you talk to them, the more you realize how clueless they are. And so, this is a concerted effort of just changing their viewpoint. And is it possible these groups could put together, weekly lunches for staffers, monthly meetings for representatives, to be able to have something where we teach them what intellectual property is about?
That's a question that's probably better addressed to Ashley, who or David Kapos, or some of the other people in this room that have spent a lot more time in talking to congressmen than I have. But having said that, one of the observations that I have made in my very limited observations of the way Congress works is these congressmen and women are inundated with things to think about. They've got not just intellectual property issues, they've got military issues, tax issues, the whole gambit of stuff that goes on in the federal government that they have to vote on. So they're utterly dependent on their staffs, and their staffs turn over at a very high rate, so that it's a little bit like trying to educate a parade. It seems to me that a program to educate staff people coming in with the assistance of the leaders in Congress with respect to these issues, because they are very complicated issues. I don't for a second believe that this is a simple undertaking, but it is possible for people to understand in very simple terms the function of the Bayh-Dole Act and the function of university research and the function of being able to protect an invention that is not going to produce any money for 10 or 12 years, and $2 billion, I think the number that Corey threw out to this earlier this afternoon, 2-point-something billion dollars to get an ordinary drug through the pipeline to market. That's a huge amount of money to ask people to put up when they don't have a reliable set of property rights.
Well, I will say that NVCA, we host a VC 101 in Congress twice a year, which is more focused on the basics and the fundamentals of what venture is. Because to your point, the churn and burn in Washington is real. And, especially intellectual property, probably by the time a lot of staffers are able to conceptualize it, they might be moving on to, whatever their next role is. And so I would say, at least on the venture side, we regularly have 101 roundtables. We have our board come in as well. And most recently, I had a few of our life sciences investors actually talk to some key staff on the pill penalty that was mentioned earlier as well. And so, usually when it's issue specific, we make sure to bring some relevant investors in the room to make sure to break it down, because one interesting thing is, the perspectives of those two groups of VC and Congress are fundamentally, at odds, where someone is thinking on a 15-year horizon versus like a 2 to 4. And so it is always, a great conversation to have, but continuously educating is definitely a priority of ours. And then we also have something called VC University, which is an online programming platform that we encourage both congressional staff and also agency staff to go through. I know of quite a few that have, and it just teaches the fundamentals of the venture industry and startup economy as well. So a number of founders go through it too.
Hey, thanks all. Very interesting comments, presentations. This is maybe mostly for Mark, but maybe a little bit for Ashlyn. So, Mark, I find what you presented to be very persuasive, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute and would love to get your kind of reaction. So the shift in VC funding, how much of that is, maybe there's an underlying change in the composition in the underlying economy, right, to potentially less patent intensive industries, that's where growth is, that's where VC is then focused, versus how much has VC funding changed to then sort of impact, what are the growth sectors, moving away from more patent intensive to less patent intensive. Does that question make sense? I'm just trying to understand, is this causality? Is there an underlying shift in the composition, of industries in the underlying economy? If there's anything you can say to speak to that, that would be great.
Certainly. It's a really fair question. And, when I have a paper that'll be published as book chapter in an Oxford University Press book and a paper in the works and I'm very careful to not claim causation. It's causation's, of course, the gold standard for this kind of econometric research. These are descriptive statistics. And what I've done is in the past, I did this research first as a white paper for Bob's organization, USIJ. And there we did some qualitative research where we backed up the descriptive statistics with discussions with venture capitalists and innovators, and they talked about some of these very issues as influencing them. Now, the problem with that kind of qualitative research is there's selection bias. But it does tend to reveal the logic of decision-making. Some of the most interesting things were in that qualitative research. We're talking to people who'd been in the medical device investment business for over 20 years, like Josh Macauer, who has been very, very successful and unusually successful at it. Like most of their startups actually pay out. And they have consciously shifted their their strategy, what kind of products they develop, the IP strategies they use in response to this. Now that's anecdotal. Now there's sectoral research that does tend to indicate, that venture support this general trend. Particularly now, some of the things we're seeing with the IRA, that's of course not IP, but it shows, when you suppress the returns, you get less investment in the R&D. We've got some good survey research, like the original Berkeley survey of startups that do talk about the importance of patents to certain sectors of startups. And we've got David Taylor's paper where he surveyed which was a paper that came from the Edison Fellowship that we now do here at IPPI. But David's paper, where he surveyed VCs, as I mentioned earlier, who confirmed that the eligibility decisions were affecting their decision making. I wish I were clever enough to come up with an instrumental variable or something that helped establish causation, although instrumental variables are often dubious and they're not very easy to communicate to an audience anyway, like this, a general audience. But I made a try at it. But I think we do definitely see there's a simple logic to what investors have to decide when they're picking startups, and the more you increase uncertainty, decrease return, they're just generally going to move away from those investments to others, and it's going to make that marginal difference.
Another thought here. It's the changes that cause people to be more risk averse are kind of at the core of the question you just asked. But venture capital back at the time in the 70s and 80s, when venture capital really started taking off, high risk projects were the reason they were in the business, because they recognized that they got better returns if they could get one company out of 4 or 5 to make it through the pipeline and actually start to sell innovative products. They could make enough money on the one company that made it to have several others fail. But if you start changing the equation, the risk equation, then the money starts going somewhere else. There's a company in Southern California called Tri-Alpha. Its original name was Tri-Alpha. I think today the name is TAE. They are building a fusion reactor. They've been, I think they were founded originally in 1998. So we are 28 years into the history of that company. They've been running primarily on investor capital. And those are the kinds of risks that I don't think companies would take today.
I think that was a great question, and kind of was to my point on just correlation isn't necessarily causation, but I think that presentation was fantastic in a sense that I think folks that are dedicated into a med device, a life sciences, patent reliability is critical in their investment structuring. When I was kind of going more macro to there was other, things happening around that timeline. Obviously, there was, the financial crisis. There was a lot of just the boom of the .com era, software emerging more and more. There was a lot of factors there. So I do agree that there are various variables as to maybe why there was a drop off. But I do agree with the sentiment in Mark's presentation that industries that strictly rely on patents specifically, do include the patent eligibility within the ROI calculation. Thanks.
Hi, so I have a question about the CCB and its compliance rate, but first I have some comments. So I am finishing up a law review article. I read and studied the history of all 13,000 plus claims that were filed with the CCB. And I'm a little less optimistic. I think that the Copyright Office gave a rosier picture than what is really going on. Far more troubling than the failure to serve rate is the compliance rate. So I don't know if you picked up on that in the report. So for those who don't know, unlike in federal court where you file your complaint, you're good to go, before the CCB, your claim after it's filed goes through a compliance review. So it's basically like you're hit with a 12B6 right off the bat. And right now, over half of the claims are found not to be compliant. So they just die. And then the opt-out figure is misleading because they measured that as to all the claims that were filed. But the true measure is how many claims make it through compliance review, then get served, how many of those respondents opt out. And when you look at that, it's about half. So half of the people are actually opting out. So did you pick up on that at all in the CCB report?
So the compliance review is tricky, and so I haven't read all of them, and I do know that the question is a compliance review garbage collection, or is it impeding the operation of a CCB? And my impression is there's a mix of claims going in, that a lot of them are very generously called quasi-copyright, and as well as plenty of more valid claims. So I guess the question is this an issue of pro se which can often be problematic procedurally? I'd also be curious, and I haven't seen the numbers, as to those with counsel versus pro se and how we're going through that.
It's 93% of pro se are the ones who are not passing compliance review. But so I am one of the directors of the Arts and Entertainment Law Clinic at Detroit Mercy. The students and I handle these claims. And so I'm happy to hear that New Hampshire will be doing this as well. And I encourage others here to get involved too. But one of the services we provide is that when a claimant doesn't initially file a compliant claim, we help revise it so it becomes compliant. So based on my experiences, based on reading the orders to amend, yes, there are some junk claims, but a lot of them are legitimate. They just don't know how to adequately plead copyright infringement.
So I guess part of the problem then is education, and I think the CCB could probably do a better job then of doing some education in the pipeline to help get a better complaint going in as well. Yeah, well, we should definitely talk more as well off the record.
I think that's our time for this panel. Just so I thank the panelists. Thank you very much.